we've seen studies of baby chimps, and if they're not held when they're young, they will die. And that's a pretty interesting thing to think about. Being held and being touched by another chimp or by a human helped them thrive,
Uh-huh.
And I feel like we lose sight of that as adults. Women in our culture, it's much more acceptable for us to touch and chat and hold hands and connect and lean on each other and hug. And with guys, especially older guys, it's not so much the thing, I feel like the younger generations have started to figure out, co-ed touching is just fine and it's pretty a normal thing. But especially the older people right now, older single guys, I am in so much, I feel so much for where they are.
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com.
Doing creative work can be kind of lonely, and that's why we built the Unmistakable Listener Tribe. The tribe is a community for professionals to connect and support each other. Everything is designed to help you grow your business and share what's working and what isn't. And that's true whether you're a business owner or an artist. You'll get access to feedback, live conversations with guests, and so much more. By joining the tribe, you become part of a community of creators who all support each other, and it's completely free. Hopefully I'll see you there. Visit unmistakablecreative.com/tribe to join. Again, that's unmistakablecreative.com/tribe. Rebecca, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Hi, Srini. It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it is my pleasure to have you here. So as I was saying before we hit record here, there was one line in your pitch that was kind of the thing that made me immediately say yes. When I read the phrase, I'm a courtesan, I was like, holy shit, I need to know more. But before we get into all of that, as you know from being a listener, I like to start with weird questions that have nothing to do with your work. So I want to start asking what I think is actually kind of a fitting question given your story. And that is, what social group were you a part of in high school? And what impact did that end up having on the choices that you've made throughout your life and career?
That's a very interesting question because I was one of those kids. I started high school as a bookworm, pretty unpopular. And then the next year I did some sports, which I felt really good about. So I was kind of with the smart, athletic kids. And then the year after that, I fractured my spine. And so I ended up working after school instead of playing sports. So I had a whole different friend group. And then the last year, it was pretty much honors classes and AP classes and stuff like that. So I feel like every year I had a different friend group. So it made it really easy for me to shift around and get to know different types of people. And I think how it's affected me is I'm just curious about people. People come from all different walks of life and they've led different and interesting lives. And I like hearing about it.
Yeah. What are the lessons you took away from each group that you feel have shaped who you've become, what you've done, and, kind of how you see the world?
From the athletes, I feel like there's a determination to do something spectacular, which I feel like that's made a big difference in my life. Just the idea that you can do something bigger and harder than you ever thought you could.
Yeah.
That's made a big difference.
What do you think happens to us that we lose that determination as we get older? Because that's the funny thing. I see so many people who want to do things, who talk about the things they want to do, but that determination changes, I see, with age, and of course, there are obvious factors that make a difference, right? Like lifestyle, certain things are just not possible. Like you inevitably have an opportunity cost to every decision you make. And I think people often don't realize that, I think one of my favorite phrases I ever heard from somebody was that you can have it all, just not all at once.
I like that.
So back to the question, what do you think it is that happens to that determination as we get older? Like, why do we lose that?
I think there's two things that happens. I think one, we get it beaten out of us by the people around us who look at us and say, well, you're not that special, so you really can't do anything that much better than me. So just sit down, shut up, and learn your place. And then I think the other thing that happens is we actually just forget why we're passionate about something. We think when we're young, this is the thing that we really want to do and we're passionate and excited about it. And so we start moving in the direction of it. And then at some point, the dynamic changes and what we're getting out of it changes and what we really care about changes. And if we're not paying attention to that shift in desire, to that shift in curiosity and pleasure, then it can leave us out in this road in the middle of nowhere that we didn't know we were heading towards that has nothing to do with what we care about.
Yeah. So how do we get it back then? How do we find our way back to the very thing that we wanted so badly?
Well, my answer is easy. It's look for what pleases me, look for pleasure. And by pleasure, I don't mean just the thing that kind of titillates you and excites you a little bit. I mean, the kind of pleasure that leaves you with more energy than before.
Well, so it's funny. Speaking of pleasure, like I just had Tal Ben-Shahar here, the guy who basically runs a happiness course at Harvard, is kind of, outside of Martin Seligman, probably the other godfather of this whole positive psychology movement. And he makes this really interesting distinction, what he calls sort of the 4 archetypes of happiness. And he said, like you have this sort of hedonistic pleasure seeker, which you kind of see, with people who do a lot of drugs, people who spend their time at places like Burning Man, like this is their, sole existence, but they have to keep seeking a pleasure mechanism because the pleasure doesn't last. So, how do you find, a sense of sustainable pleasure in your life without necessarily compromising every area of it?
It's a good question. I feel like it has a lot to do with paying attention to fulfillment, because to me, pleasure and fulfillment really go hand in hand. But I think for a lot of people, they've been disconnected for a while. But real pleasure is fulfilling. And if you're having that kind of hedonistic pleasure that's, okay, this weekend is really, really fun, but next week I'm going to be paying for it. And I got to find another way to excite myself the weekend after that, you're kind of missing the point of life, right? So for me, it's so much more fulfilling to have a group of my friends over for a dinner party where we all talk about life and curious things than it is to sit around and do drugs with people. I mean, nothing wrong with drugs. And the fulfillment that I get out of it is very, very different. So no doubt. That kind of pleasure, fulfillment goes hand in hand with it.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the trajectory that's led you to where you're at. Because like I said, like pretty much anybody I've ever talked to, Courtesan is not on the list of things your high school guidance counselor suggests as a potential career path. So what in the world has been the trajectory that has led you down to what you do?
That's a very good question. Okay. So long story or short story?
Long story, always.
Okay. Right. So the long story is I grew up in a small town and had a really amazing boyfriend when I was in high school. And when he graduated a year before I did, and we were separated by 1,500 miles for a year. And that was really difficult. So he went and found this thing online called polyamory, which means many loves. And there was a book at the time that was kind of the polyamory Bible that's called The Ethical Slut. And he asked me to read it. And so we read it together and we started talking about it and thought, okay, polyamory could really work for us. Let's try it. So we did that and then had a great relationship for a while. I ended up not seeing him anymore and then getting married and then getting divorced when I was 28 or 29. And as I was getting divorced, I was like, okay, am I still committed to this polyamory thing? Oh, yes, I am. Okay. Am I still committed to, being partnered? No, actually, I don't really want to be partnered right now. I just want to travel around and see the world and get to know myself again. So I started dating online, just dating. I wasn't looking for any kind of partnership or anything. I just wanted to see if I was still attractive and if people still found me interesting or if I'd lost all that in 9 years. And I'd never dated online before. It was kind of about the time that online dating was happening. So I started dating and I found some really interesting people. And there was this one person who I was having a really beautiful summer fling with. And I was also in the process of moving out of my old house with my ex-husband. So I decided to approach one of my girlfriends and see if she'd be interested in sharing a place together. And so we met at this beautiful park one afternoon and we're talking and making plans. And she said, well, if we're going to live together, you should know what I really do for a living. And I was like, okay, what is it? I thought you were a therapist. And so she tells me, and I think the way she told me was basically the fun that I was having with that new lover was what she got paid to do. And I thought about that, and I looked back at the summer, and I was like, okay, that sounds too good to be true. I've got to look this up and do some research. And so I did, and I looked it up for probably 2 or 3 months. I did a bunch of exploration and journaling, and like, would I really like to do this? Would I feel horrible about myself afterwards if I did it? And finally came to this point where logically I thought this could work really well, but there's no way to know until I try it. So I made a deal with myself. I would try it once, and if I hated it, I would forgive myself and not look back. And I tried it, and I loved it. It was so much fun. And I said, okay, I think I can make this work for myself. So that was how I got into the industry.
Remember more, improve your focus, and multitask better. Hum is a brain sharpener that helps you do all three. Hum's wearable boosts your working memory and will be available in late 2021. Sign up to be notified when Hum launches and to learn more about the science behind Hum at thinkhum.com. That's thinkhum.com. Hum is designed for healthy adults and should not be used if you're pregnant, have cognitive impairment, implanted devices, or a history of seizures. The Hum patch is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent disease. To learn more, go to thinkhum.com.
Sound plays a much bigger role in our lives than most of us even are aware of. An EPOS podcast powered by audio tells stories behind the sounds we hear every day, sounds that inform, entertain, educate, get our attention, influence our behavior, and save our lives. Randy Zuckerberg and her guests explore how audio shapes our experience and how pioneers are creating the sound of the future. You know all those sounds from your devices when you're using apps or receiving text messages or anything else online? Well, it turns out somebody actually has a job doing that. Randy talks to the experts behind these sounds to find out about the work that goes into designing what she calls those sonic logos. As a podcast host, I think a lot about how sound impacts us, whether we're hearing it on a podcast or from a notification on a phone or from some app we're using. And if you want to learn more about the impact that sound has on our lives, listen and subscribe to EPOS's Powered by Audio on Acast, iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Wow. Okay. So, I mean, this raises numerous questions, as you might imagine. I think that the first place I want to go with this is, family, because I think particularly in a culture that I grew up in, I think that if any Indian girl went to her father and told her, this is what I am going to do with my career, I think she would be ostracized from the family. I think that that would be the ultimate test of the relationship that anybody would have with somebody in my family. Would be like, what? Because as it is, it's a culture of tremendous judgment, no matter what you do as a career. I know this firsthand as a creative, but when you have to tell members of your family that this is what you've chosen to do with your life, what is that conversation like? What are the parts that are hard? How do you find a sense of acceptance among the people in your life who may judge you for these choices?
That's a good question. For a long time, I was really only telling people who I was close to and who I knew well enough to know that they weren't going to be super judgmental. I probably lasted about a year. And then I started to be more and more open with it because I realized that I can't really have an intimate friendship or an intimate relationship with somebody that doesn't know something about my life that was so core to who I was. It's not that I am a courtesan at my core, but I am curious about people, and I am open about sexuality, and I am, willing to go to unusual places with people. And those are all important parts of me. And being able to do that in my work and not being able to share it with the people that I care about just didn't jive. So I started telling people more and more. I told my siblings first. I did eventually tell my dad a couple years ago. And my siblings almost all had the same reaction, as well as most of my friends. They asked 2 questions. Are you safe? And are you happy? And once they had satisfactory answers to both of those questions, then, they were like, okay, well, if you're safe and you're happy, and I can tell you're happy because of the way you're moving about life, I can't really say anything about it. And so slowly they would start to, learn more about what I actually did and how it was not really what they expected. And that was nice because over time, I feel like My friends and family have grown to respect this world in a way that they didn't before.
Yeah.
And my dad was a different situation. He never asked, "Are you safe and are you happy?" Because I'm pretty sure he knows me so well. He knows there's no way I would do it if I wasn't safe and happy.
Yeah. So what did your dad ask about this? And then you said your siblings, after asking those two questions, kind of accepted it. And what I wonder, and this is out of personal curiosity, I mean, you having heard the show may have heard her interview with Sarah Vandella, the adult film star. And what I wonder is, what are the misperceptions from the outside that people might have of the kind of work that you do? And what do you want them to know?
The misperceptions are easy. I think people assume that my work is all about the fucking, and it almost never is. And I think they also assume that people end up getting into this industry because they don't have any other choices.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of women in this area who this is the best way for them to be really connected and happy, attentive parents, you know. And of course, I can't share any of their names because that could get them in trouble. But
yeah,
it's a really beautiful world once I got into it. There's so much more care and like actually trying to see each other for who you are. That's probably the biggest misconception. People don't realize when you have your clothes off, you're a lot more open and intimate than you think you are.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that absolutely okay. So that actually is another question. What role do you think media plays in creating these misperceptions? Because, to your point, whether it's in the movies, whether it's on TV, the way that, sex workers are portrayed is largely as victims of, horrible shit that's happened to them in their past, having no alternatives. So we're, at least in my mind, that's what I see as media portrayals of sex work. But what role do you think the media plays in creating that perception? And what do you think is the responsibility of people who create media when they're talking about this to people like you? Like, in this moment, what is the responsibility I have to my audience when we're sharing this story?
That's a good question. I think media definitely has played a big role in the perception. But to be honest, I think it goes deeper than that. I think it's deeper than media, because media is really just, they're creating a character that people will relate to and people will be able to understand. So they have to play off of what is already in the culture to some extent. I think what really is the root cause here is more religion, especially in the US.
Yeah.
So we have a culture that is based on Puritanism and on the idea that, sex is not really for enjoyment. And if you have a porn addiction or something like that, you should be ashamed of yourself. There's so many pieces of the dominant religions that we have here in the US that make sexuality and everything related to sexuality and money feel like a dirty thing, like you're not supposed to do it and you should be ashamed of yourself, or somebody should be ashamed of themselves.
Yeah.
And then that shows up in movies. But.
Well, let's actually talk about that, because I think that I've always said the irony of being raised, in our culture is we literally write a manual on sex that is sustained for hundreds of years. Yet we come from one of the most sexually repressed cultures in the world. It's funny. I mean, and I've talked about this on the show before. I remember the first time I saw my parents kiss each other, I was probably 28. I was like, I wish I could unsee that, because it was just one of those things where we didn't ever talk about it. I remember to this day, my sister explaining to me her version of the sex talk, which was the strangest thing. She said, she was about to go to college, and my dad called her to his office, and she's like, "Oh God," she's like, "He's calling to the office?" Like, and she knew right then and there that this is what she was getting into. And he literally basically went on this hour-long spiel about all the things that I did wrong at Berkeley. He was like, "Your brother was an idiot. He got bad grades. Don't replicate, what he did. Do well. by the way, we don't believe in premarital sex. And he just moved on from that. That was it. He's like one line. So I want to actually talk about the role that parents play, in educating their kids about sexuality, the role schools plays. Because even when I was talking to Sarah Vandella, I told her, like, the extent of sex education in school is watching sperm swim under a microscope. Like, you don't actually learn anything about the reality of sex. And I remember watching this Michael Moore documentary where they were teaching sex education to French school children. And in contrast, he had this, media clip from the US where some governor in Texas was talking about abstinence. And he was like, abstinence works. He's like, what do you mean abstinence works? You have the highest teen pregnancy rate in the country. So, I mean, let's start there. Like, how do we begin to change how we're educating young people about sex? And teach them to stop seeing it as this thing to be ashamed of? Because I can tell you that I think I felt very uncomfortable about this for a very, very long time. I mean, I left college without ever losing my virginity. I was like, how does that even happen? To me, that was like one of the things that I was ashamed of for years.
Yeah, that's a pretty in-depth question. I think, knowing a little bit about my history about sexual education might be helpful here. So I grew up in a very small town, and we had, for some reason, because of where we lived, we had access to really fantastic teachers, even though we were a super small school budget. And one of the teachers there was, I don't know if it was one of the teachers or someone who was a mom of one of the kids, but she was a nurse. And so in high school, after seeing the health education, the sex education that we got in gym class, she decided to hold an after-school, month-long optional sex ed thing. And I think it was 2 days a week for 4 weeks. And anyway, she spent 2 or 3 hours each time educating us about STIs and about pregnancy and about, how important the decision to have sex is, and doing role playing and things. For the most part, it was pretty fantastic training. There was one piece in there where they did this gum thing where you like pass your gum around to other people, and then that's how you think about having sex with how many other people have been chewing your gum, which I would not encourage that in any sex education. A little bit of slut shaming there without realizing it. But other than that, I learned so much about the options that were there. And the thing that I learned that was most important is that when it was going to matter, I probably wasn't going to take the time to make a decision. So I needed to make a decision about what I was going to do before it mattered, before I wanted to take any action. So that was super helpful. Like, even as an adult, I'm sure there are most other women out there who are doing the same thing too. You know how the date's going to end before anything happens. And you're prepared for that, right? Or at least I am. So I think that kind of sex education would be much more useful.
Okay. So what do you think that parents should be telling their kids about sex?
I think just being real about sex is probably the best way of approaching it. I think most parents are pretty uncomfortable talking about it themselves. So, but there's a certain amount of honesty in that kind of authenticity. The other thing that was really helpful for me is I found with that high school boyfriend and I, we were both engineers and geeks. So we went and found a website called sexuality.org, which doesn't exist anymore, but it was run by a group of people in Seattle who had a sex positive club. I think it was called the Wet Spot. And so they created sexuality.org. It was almost all text-based, and it was all about sex and sex safety and kink safety and STIs and polyamory and all this other stuff that, just information that you needed to know. But the fact that it was all text and it was really well organized and that you could kind of pick your own adventure and see what you needed to learn about that day. My boyfriend and I used that so much. We learned a lot from that.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I guess the other question that I want to ask you is, what do you think men don't know about women that they should, particularly in this context? Because I remember, I did some work with a dating coach, Nick Notice, who's also been a guest here on the podcast. And one of the things that he was telling me about was how that the Me Too movement was a very important conversation. It needed to happen, but he was having a challenge with a lot of his clients where they were getting scared to even initiate any sort of physical contact because they were so scared of being accused of something or being seen as like a pervert or something. And I think that even when you read, the story of which, Aziz Ansari was accused, I think almost all of us who are men, we looked at that like trying to think back to our own dates, like, wow, are there moments where I crossed a line or pushed a line to where I made somebody uncomfortable without even realizing it?
Yeah, it's a tough thing to go back and look at, isn't it?
Yeah, it's an incredibly tough thing to look at because, I talked to my own roommates about this. We're all stand-up guys. We're not the kinds of people who would intentionally hurt anybody or do anything awful. But then it's hard not to look at, your own past experience and wonder if there are moments where you behaved in questionable ways. And, you kind of like, thank God social media didn't exist because nobody could go and broadcast this to the world. But I guess that, back to the question is what do you think that men don't know that you want them to know as a woman when it comes to having a sex positive attitude and yet at the same time being respectful of a woman's boundaries?
I think an important thing here is that women change their mind very, very quickly. And if you don't have an open line of communication, I feel like that's where things get really, really sticky. And there are people that just don't want to have open communication about this, which is difficult for me because I'm someone who, hey, if we're going to do something, then we're also going to talk about it. If we can't talk about it, we're probably not mature enough to do it. Right.
Yeah.
And so the fact that the woman that you're with might look like she's all in, and then all of a sudden something feels different. I think most men are not going to notice the feel different right away. Most women do. And so they assume that the men do as well. So knowing that it will change really quickly and have an open line of communication so you can find out if it has changed, that's probably my best tip.
Okay. Well, let's do this. I want to talk specifically about relationships. Now, it's funny because, you look on certain dating websites. There's a dating website called Meet Mindful, and, there's a section that basically says not for me. And the amount of times I've seen polyamory in the profiles I've clicked on, I would say 90 to 100%. And in all honesty, I think I probably fall into that category as well. Like, I think it would be very, very difficult for somebody like me, because I remember even talking to Sarah Vandella, I said, when somebody is dating you, somebody's in a relationship with you, I'd imagine they'd have to have bulletproof self-worth to be able to be okay with knowing that this is the line of work. So I wonder, one, do you have actual relationships outside of the people who are your clients? And what do those relationships look like? How do they function in a way that's emotionally healthy? And, what does it take for somebody to even be able to handle this? Because like I said, I don't think that I have the kind of self-esteem that would make it easy for me to go through this. Like, it sounds nice in theory and fun, but I think in reality, I would probably be like, no, this just isn't for me.
Yeah, that's perfectly understandable. It is definitely a pretty big self-growth challenge to step into polyamory. It was something that I was up for, though, and I chose it when I was 19. So I feel like at this point, I've learned, not everything, but I've learned enough that I'm really, really comfortable in polyamory, and I'm really happy. And I find that is the best way to get all of my needs met over the long term. I'm actually a very partner-focused kind of polyamory. So I do have relationships out of work, and I always have. And I find it to be really important. I find that my non-work relationships do take priority over work too. So on the occasion when they're fighting over my time, it's pretty easy for me to decide what to do. When it comes to the people that I date having to have bulletproof self-confidence, that's probably pretty true. And I think the fact that I have pretty strong self-confidence to begin with means that that's who I match up with more often than not anyway. But there's an article that I read on Facebook years ago. Someone else had written how to date a sex worker article. And it was so lovely. There were a couple of pieces in there that I just had to share. I've shared it with everyone that I've dated since. One of them was, when I have a bad day, don't try and talk me out of my career. Because there are occasionally days that are just not as good. Sometimes you forget your chapstick or something and you're just not as comfortable. It's just not as fun. But that doesn't mean, you should get out of the business. And maybe it does. Maybe it does for you. But my bad day versus most people's bad days, very, very different, very mild, I think. And then the other piece that I found really important out of that article was, remember, she's coming home to you. She's not asking you to be anybody different. She's coming home to you. And think about what that means for a minute, right? So this is someone that gets paid to entertain people, and she wants to spend time with you. The more you think about that, and the more you realize that's true, and the more you're with the partner and they're totally present and they really like, your company, and their body responds to you really well, that develops bulletproof confidence, I think.
Remember more, improve your focus, and multitask better. Hum is a brain sharpener that helps you do all three. Hum's wearable boosts your working memory and will be available in late 2021. Sign up to be notified when Hum launches and to learn more about the science behind Hum at thinkhum.com. That's thinkhum.com. Hum is designed for healthy adults and should not be used if you're pregnant, have cognitive impairment, implanted devices, or a history of seizures. The Hum patch is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent disease. To learn more, go to thinkhum.com.
This episode of The Unmistakable Creative is supported by RemoteWorks, a podcast that tells extraordinary stories of teams that made the shift to flexible working. If there's anything that last year taught us, it's that the way we work has changed forever. And in each episode of RemoteWorks, host Melanie Green tells an insightful story about how people and companies are adapting. She talks about the very problems that all of us are dealing with. Last season, in Preventing Burnout, people learned about the challenges and rewards of working remotely during the pandemic. Now, I don't know about you, but I have definitely felt that there are days when I am burned out, and sometimes I don't even know when I am done working because it's all I do. A recent study found that 75% of workers have experienced burnout, and 40% said their burnout was a direct result of the pandemic. But what if we don't know the signs of impending burnout? You'll hear firsthand from someone who has been through burnout, as well as get expert advice on how to recognize it and what you can do to prevent it from happening. In this season, RemoteWorks explores several other topics related to the new world of work. For those of you who are baseball fans that are missing those days of eating overpriced hot dogs and drinking oversized beers, they pull back the curtain at Major League Baseball for a glimpse of how America's most beloved pastime is working remotely. You'll hear how the MLB has had to adjust just about everything that they do, from new rules about how we gather to virtual fans in stadium. You'll get to look at how they've embraced this new world of flexible work. I recently listened to the Burnout episode of the RemoteWorks podcast, and here's what I thought. Melanie does an amazing job bringing in diverse perspectives from experts and people who are dealing with the issues these experts are trying to solve. It's basically a combination of great storytelling with practical advice that you can apply to your life or your work. So search for RemoteWorks anywhere you listen to podcasts. Thanks to RemoteWorks for their support.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you specifically use the phrase, this is somebody who gets paid to entertain people. And earlier you said it's not just about the fucking. So I want to go deeper into that. I had asked Sarah Vendel a similar question, because she had mentioned she works with the Mustang Ranch outside of doing adult films. And I said, what misperceptions do we have about the kinds of people who are your clients? Because I think, again, we go back to media perception. What do? We basically say, the people who end up in places like this are lecherous old men who are perverted. But, she kind of shattered the perception of that. And I'm curious kind of what your own experience of that has been. Like, what are the types of people who come to somebody like you or come to somebody like a Courtesan?
Yeah. Well, my client base is pretty much split about 4 ways, not quite equally. So there are some of I think what people would typically expect, the middle-aged men who their marriage is just sexless now and they need to find some way of having that connection. They love their wife. They don't want to leave her. They don't want to cheat on her. They don't want to have someone texting them in the middle of the night because they're having an affair. They just need to be listened to and to be felt and feel like a man for a little while. So that's a common person. I think the people that you wouldn't really expect, though, are the younger guys. Like you mentioned the Me Too movement. I've noticed in the last 2 years or so, I've gotten a lot of guys in their 20s and their early 30s that have come to see me, which didn't happen before. It was almost all people in their 40s and over. And they've been coming to see me and telling me, I'm not really sure about dating right now. And I just kind of wanted to get some practice with someone who wasn't going to sue me or was likely to tell me that was too far instead of, posting it all over social media that I did something. So that's been pretty interesting, getting to know that new market. And then I also have a pretty big chunk of people that are in their, 40s that are really career focused, and they just don't have the time or the mental space for a relationship, but they do really want to have connection, and they want to have connection over the long term. So I have people that have been seeing me on a regular basis for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, just so they can have that connection, that knowing that somebody sees them and that physical intimacy, and have a place for that, a place where it fits.
So I think it's fascinating that you talk about connection of all things. So let's go back to, the married guy who is in a sexless marriage. Does that person actually tell their significant other that they're seeing you? And how does that play out in the marriage?
It depends. Some of them do. I think the majority of them don't. Some of them do. And I do live in a town that is pretty open about sexuality to begin with. So I think that's probably why some of my clients actually have been able to tell their partners, hey, this is what I'm doing. And oftentimes the partner's like, all right, well, don't bring home any diseases, don't bring home any babies, and don't embarrass me. Okay. And yeah, that's perfectly reasonable.
Okay. It's interesting because I think that, we go back to religion, there are some people who immediately be like, all right, well, there's a question of morality here. Like, are you cheating on somebody when you're doing that if you're not telling them?
Yeah, honestly, the answer to that question, I think, is yes. And it's kind of none of my business. So I do end up talking with this about a lot of clients oftentimes. And I've actually talked a couple through figuring out how to tell their partners, what they felt like needed to tell them so that they could be in integrity again. And that has been an interesting journey to watch that.
Yeah.
But yeah, really a relationship.
I guess the interesting thing for me then is the question of, for you, do you ever feel that you're crossing a line of morality when, somebody comes to see you without necessarily telling their partners, knowing that potentially, like, if the partner were to find out, it could end the relationship? And again, no judgment on my part. This is just out of curiosity.
Yeah. I feel like the fact that I just have a website and they have to come and find me and they have to book with me takes a lot of that away. Well, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't feel responsible. If I was to reach out and try and seduce them into spending time with me, I would feel different about that. But the fact that they've already made the decision themselves, they're just finding out who they want to spend time with, but they've decided.
Interesting. All right. So let's talk about the entertaining and connection piece, because I think that, again, like on the surface, probably for a person who doesn't necessarily fall, onto this end of the moral spectrum might say, okay, that's immoral, that's unethical, this can't possibly be about entertainment and connection. So when you say connection, what do you mean by that? Like, what does that look like? And then the other question is, when you have sex with somebody who comes to you in this context versus sex with potentially with an actual partner or somebody you're in a relationship with, how do those two things differ?
They're not that different. I think people assume that I don't usually have any kind of emotional involvement or positive regard for my clients, and that's totally not true. So I actually do love some of my clients. And so when we're together in bed, it doesn't necessarily feel that different from being with a partner. And maybe that's because in my personal relationships, I'm also a pretty strong and independent person. So I don't feel like the wilting violet that needs to be taken over kind of thing. I don't know if that makes any sense, but yeah, it is different, but it's not that different. Oftentimes, sex with clients is as good or almost as good as sex with my personal partners.
Okay, interesting. So then I guess the other question around that, right, is you mentioned you love your clients. So the question for me then becomes, how do you make that sort of distinction of preventing somebody from basically falling in love with you and developing an emotional attachment, to you that at some point becomes unhealthy or, is just not, it basically, they want to move it to a place that it's never going to go.
Yeah. Well, I found that over the course of the last couple of years, the easiest way for me to deal with that is be really clear upfront as early as possible. So I have things on my website. Don't expect any time that's not being paid for. I have, pretty clear expectation setting there. And then when they do come to start seeing me, if I notice that someone seems to be having a bit more attachment, I will call it out and I'll talk to them about it, because the earlier you talk about it, the better. However, I don't actually have a problem with people falling in love with me. I am totally okay with my clients loving me. I am not okay with them trying to change me or save me or get me out of the business or tell me what to do or impact my personal partners. But for the most part, once someone gets to the point where they're like, oh my gosh, I love you, they know me well enough that they know trying to change me would not work and it would be detrimental. So I've probably only had one person who got a little attached, and I was able to say, this is not really going to work. I would like you to go and see some other ladies so you can spread out your curiosity. And that worked really well. So
how common is this? Like, how common is the work that you do? Because again, it seems to me like the sort of underworld that's hidden from main society, both from the side of the people who work in it and the people who patronize it.
I don't know if I can say exactly how common it is, but I know it's a lot more common than you think. Yeah. I've actually had many people say, oh, I've never actually met a courtesan before. And sometimes I will actually say this out loud. Usually I don't, though. I'll say, well, you mean you've never actually met someone that told you they were a courtesan?
Well, yeah. I mean, like I said, that was the line in the bio that immediately got me. I was like, oh, hell yes. I definitely want to talk to you because I was just so curious about this. So one thing I wonder then, let's talk about this in the context of political and legal structures. There are countries in the world where sex work is completely legalized. And, it's not sort of, I think the stigma of it is still there, but it still exists. It's not this sort of underground thing. So when you look at sex work in the United States and the fact that it is kept underground, what do you think needs to change in terms of political and legal structures for sex workers that basically would make the whole thing better for everybody involved?
Yeah, well, that's actually why I'm here on your podcast. So I think with the political and the legal structures, first of all, I am not a super knowledgeable activist. I have friends that are super knowledgeable activists, and they have told me what really matters is decriminalizing. If it's legalized, the state still has some control over what you're allowed to do. So if it's legal, then they may or may not be able to have anal sex, and someone else gets to decide. You don't, right? But if it's decriminalized, you can't get in trouble for it, which is way better. So yes, that's what I would say. I actually had the opportunity to meet with a woman who was a sex worker in New Zealand 20 some years ago. And she was one of the women who helped push New Zealand to change the law. So it's decriminalized in New Zealand, and they have like a sex worker version of OSHA. Actually, I think they have the version of OSHA over there, which is just general work health and safety. And they had specially trained those operatives on how to deal with sex work and safety. So I thought that was really neat. They were able to spread out the burden of maintaining a healthy sex work industry through the different associations that were already there.
So I wonder, if we were to decriminalize sex work here in the United States, what do you think the impact would be, not just on sex workers, but on sort of the cultural narrative around sex positivity?
If it was decriminalized right now, I think there would be a bit of a very difficult war. As it's decriminalized, the people that are like, oh, hey, I'm loud and proud, I'm going to come out and be this, are just going to be out there ticking off the fundamentalists and people who really believe it's morally wrong, and everyone who does it should be in trouble. So my preference, I think that the best way to work around this, yes, definitely move in the political and legal arenas. But what I've been doing for the last few years is just sharing with my friends and family about what it really is about, because it's not this, at least it's never been for me, this thing where I feel exploited or taken advantage of or any of that. And in fact, some of my closest friends are clients, and a lot of my non-work related friends don't know them, but some of the people that are the closest to me and that have helped me through some really incredible things in my life and in my business are clients who I only know when we spend time together.
Yeah. Well, so speaking of difficult things, I mean, in your own life, I can't imagine that, any path for that matter, like whether it's somebody I've talked to who has built an incredible business or somebody who does something that you do, there haven't been difficult things and hardships. What are the challenges? I mean, outside of, telling the people in your life that this is what you do, what are the difficult things about this that most of us don't ever realize? And then one other follow-up to that is, you have talked about this from the standpoint of, I'm not a victim. I'm doing this out of choice. But on the flip side of that, and I asked Sarah this as well, you have people who come out of these situations just battered, broken, beaten up, and taken advantage of. And they don't look back on it as a positive experience. They don't have the attitude towards it that you have.
Yeah.
So how does that happen?
How that happens is that they don't feel like they have a lot of power in the situation to begin with. And when you feel like you don't have power, I mean, how can you really choose something that's going to work for you? I mean, one of the reasons my experience has been probably so different from what's expected is that I have always only ever done this because I wanted to. I always only see clients that I want to. So it makes a huge difference when you're a fuck yes for opting in for what you're doing. And I think anybody that's not a fuck yes should really not be in the industry. And when it's illegal, I think it makes it more difficult for people to get out of the industry, because then there's, something someone can hang over your head, and you have to go and admit that you've been doing it in the first place in order to get into some of the programs. And yeah, I don't know. I just think it's not a great situation. But when you're understanding of your power and knowing that you have all of the choices, that makes a big difference in the dynamic. At least it has for me. And so I hope that other people are able to see that and experience that. And I don't think anyone who is not a hell yes for this should be in the industry. There was the first question there, which I missed. Sorry.
Yeah. So in your own life, I mean, I don't imagine it's all been smooth sailing. Like, what have been the difficult and challenging experiences outside of, letting the people in your life know that this is what you've chosen to do? Like, what parts of your life have challenged you? And, what moments of adversity have informed where you've ended up and kind of shaped all of it?
I think the most important piece there is actually something that a lot of entrepreneurs run into. It's the being out of sync with the rest of the world. Because I don't go in at 9 a.m. and come home at 5 p.m. I sometimes work on the weekends, not as often as people think, but I have a lot of time during the day. And so I've had to find different ways over the years to keep myself engaged and keep myself connected to my friends who have completely different schedules than I do. Yeah, I think that's the hardest part, is being out of sync with people and the isolation that can come from that.
Yeah. So, the funny thing is you have this incredibly healthy take towards all of this. I guess, what I wonder is, if we were to basically, change the narrative to one of being sex positive, because I don't feel like the predominant narrative in the United States is necessarily something that is sex positivity. How do you begin to change that in an entire culture where, Puritan values have been so deeply woven in and embedded into us for so long?
I think the key there is accepting our desires and accepting what's real. And it's going to take a little while for that to happen. But I feel like I don't want to hop on the bandwagon with the LGBT crowd, but it does seem like the more understanding there is, the easier it is for people to be, I don't know, just be open and curious and listen to what's actually going on. So I think that's the key. If we can get people to talk to each other and listen and to understand their own desires and be willing to at least explore them. They don't have to go out and make them happen. But knowing why you care about things, why something excites you or arouses you, that can be very empowering. And that, in my mind, shifts the conversation around sex from, oh my gosh, this is a dangerous thing and I really shouldn't play with it, to, oh, hey, I'm in control here. Let's see what could be fun.
Yeah. So, one thing you mentioned when you wrote in was the fact that we've now, thanks to this whole shit show of a pandemic, entered effectively what is a touchless society. And I remember, in the spirit of transparency, some friends and I were doing ecstasy one night, and the girl that my roommate was dating, I remember she was touching me. She's like, oh my God. She was like, you have been so touch deprived, haven't you? And I remember reading a book called The Body Keeps Score, and how he talked about the role that touch plays and massage plays in healing trauma. And I never made that connection in my head because, Indian parents, are not necessarily the most physically affectionate people. My 6 months of therapy, I discovered that my primary love language was physical touch. And yet I, grew up in a culture where that is not that common. And so I want to talk about that in the context, not just of the pandemic, but like, what role does all of this play in our health and our happiness? And, when people don't have partners, when they're not having sex, what do you tell them?
Right now, what do I tell them? I tell them, see if you can go and find a sex buddy. Being someone who talks so openly about this stuff, that really is what I do, is talk about, hey, do you know how to negotiate with someone so that you can have what you need? And even if it's not someone that you're totally in love with right now, maybe it's just a cuddle buddy or something. But we all do need to have some kind of touch. And I'm particularly aware of the people that are living alone these days, because I live alone. And there were, 6 weeks at the beginning of the pandemic where I was on crutches, living alone in my 2-story apartment building. And that was really, really tough. We've seen studies of baby chimps, and if they're not held when they're young, they will die. And that's a pretty interesting thing to think about. Being held and being touched by another chimp or by a human helped them thrive, And I feel like we lose sight of that as adults. Women in our culture, it's much more acceptable for us to touch and chat and hold hands and connect and lean on each other and hug. And with guys, especially older guys, it's not so much the thing, I feel like the younger generations have started to figure out, co-ed touching is just fine and it's pretty a normal thing. But especially the older people right now, older single guys, I am in so much, I feel so much for where they are.
Yeah. Well, so, for your own work and in your own line of work, I'd imagine that this whole situation has affected the line of work. Like, how does it change, safety? How does it change what you are and aren't willing to do? Because, how do you know, where people have been, who they've spent their time around, how many people they've been around in a situation where literally every day on the news, it's like, we're being taught to keep our distance from each other, which literally flies in the face of everything that you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's been a really interesting challenge this year to try and bridge those two things. What I was saying earlier is encouraging people to negotiate for a sex buddy. That's pretty much what I've been doing, both with my clients and with my personal partners. Yeah. And I think the fact that I've been poly for 20 years and I've had that safe sex conversation with strangers on first and second dates so many times, it doesn't feel weird to me to have a COVID safety conversation. And so when it first became a thing here, I didn't work very much for a couple of weeks. And then I was only working with people who we had this, okay, what are your safety standards? What are your risks? What's going on? Who else is in your household? And that continued for most of the shutdown. I was able to see, I think there was 6 other people that were pretty much isolated on their own, people that work from home for the last 6 weeks. They had hardly any exposure. So we were able to find what worked for everybody in that situation. And that's pretty much what we're still doing. It's always evolving as things are changing. The city's opening up.
Yeah. I guess, we're coming close to the end of an hour here. And in some form or another, I've asked you various versions of this question, but if there's one thing that you would want, our listeners to take away from this, regardless of where, they stand, because I think that inevitably, right, even, when I was talking to Sarah Vandella, like, porn is stigmatized, sex work is stigmatized. What is it that you wish people, like, well, if you could leave them with one sort of final message on this, what do you want them to know? Like, what would you want them to take away from this? And what judgments do you want them to set aside when they're listening to somebody like you talk about the work that you do?
I would like them to know that there's nothing wrong with them and there's nothing wrong with what they want.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I think that makes a really fitting end to what has been a fascinating conversation. I feel like I could talk to you for hours about this because it's just such a deep rabbit hole with so many different layers. So as you know, I would like to finish my final question, which is how we finish all of our interviews here at the Unmistakable Creative. What do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
I think their history and how they choose to integrate that and to put that back out into the world is what makes us unmistakable. Because none of us have the same experiences. And so we're all drawing from different wells. And when we draw from our own unique well, and then we're willing to put that out somewhere for people to see, I think there's no way to get that mixed up with anybody else's stuff.
Amazing. Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us and sharing your story and your insights and wisdom with our listeners. Where can people find out more about you, your work, everything that you're up to?
They can find out more about me at pleasurecentralradio.com. And if they're really curious, they can sign up for the email alerts there. And then they will see the membership communities and the types of things that I'm doing to connect people even when we can't touch.
Amazing. And for everyone listening, we will wrap the show with that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. While you were listening, were there any moments you found fascinating, inspiring, instructive, maybe even heartwarming? Can you think of anyone, a friend or a family member who would appreciate this moment? If so, take a second and share today's episode with that one person, because good ideas and messages are meant to be shared.
Subscribe to Ready to Trade, a new 2-part series exploring the opportunities in the UK's e-commerce and healthcare sectors with business leaders in each landscape.
The UK has taken huge steps in terms of our ability to transform and rethink the way that we deliver healthcare services.
Those lessons that we've learned can apply to our international partners.
Ready to Trade is available to download and is produced by Reuters Plus in partnership with the UK's Department for International Trade.